Let's talk about failure. Specifically when you failed at the one thing you're supposed to be good at. This tarot card reminded me that there's an insane difference between painting realistically from a single reference image and puzzle painting different references together to get the desired result. When I say puzzle painting, I mean that in this case, I would create a value sketch and then pick different reference for each detail of the painting to aid me in the rendering process. For example, I'd use a horse's gesture and angle from one image, the armor from another, the landscape from yet another, and so on, till I have a whole collage, which shall help me in the pursuit of reaching believability and realism. My decision to paint the Knight of Swords card this time came out of pure laziness. I wanted to paint something that I could finish fast, and this one offered the perfect opportunity as I've already started working on it years ago. Originally, I had used 3D to help myself with the gesture, the anatomy, the angles, and framing of the horse and knight. I rendered them inside a HDRI desert and did some photo bashing and painting on top of my render. I didn't like what I ended up with, something fell off, so years later I decided to work on top of it, thinking I won't take longer than a week to finish. How was I wrong? Took me a month. I was completely alien to the world of medieval war fashion and never cared to even try to paint a horse or knight. So in order to warm up to this painting, I decided to do a couple of armor, knight, and horse render studies. And in hindsight, I believe I should have prepared myself with documentaries as well, and definitely will for the upcoming knight cards. However, I knew that I needed to establish a visual library which would guide and intuitively suggest what steps I'd have to take in order to create a good design and believable render for this Knight of Swords tarot card. I needed to know how horses moved and felt, how the armor of the knight would wrap around its body, arms, and shoulders, and Pinterest is my go-to source for visually pleasing images. I avoid Google image search because of the results. They always end up looking like I had an accountant do the mood board for me. I start with a black silhouette and outline the inner shapes in white. I paint in the darkest hues first and then I add the lighter ones on top, as I find it easier to work from dark to bright. I pick a textured brush that resembles the armor texture on the image that I reference off of. The round shield was definitely the hardest thing to paint. I have a hard time with circular or oval objects. I don't know how you feel about it, but that's like my crippling thing. When I do these studies, I focus on learning the general principle of what I'm trying to convey. So what are the rules to getting metal look shiny, or how do I get that characteristic sheen in the horse's fur? It's easy to lose myself in copying pixels when I do studies, so I must remind myself on focusing on the lessons that are to be learned. Especially engravings and how to make them look and feel realistic with just a few brushstrokes was something I've wanted to learn from this exercise specifically. The reflections of the surroundings on the armor were super important to me as well, as I wanted to see how the sky and landscape would bend around the armor and how the distortions were going to look and mix with the sheen of the metal. I also paid attention to the armor, how the different pieces overlay and how the shadow suggests the amount of space the armor pieces keep between each other. I kept an eye on the shape language of the armor and how different parts were welded and bolted together. The longer I looked, the more evident the purpose of every single piece of armor became to me. I love how some horse helmets had ear protectors as well. The thought of sliced off horse ears made me cringe while painting these studies. But I was very pleased with the outcome of this exercise, which in turn made me very confident to move on to the next phase. I opened my old file and started painting over the 3D knight. Perhaps you can see the render grain on this image, which I'm working on painting over. This render was generated with a wide angle lens, which I love to abuse and overuse, I know. Once I find an image with a horse that has a similar pose to the 3D version, I start to overpaint my 3D kitbash render. I quickly realized though that the dynamic depth starts to get lost. I become insecure about the image and start sketching other options in hopes to get some of the dynamic depth back. However, I really want to get that whole body shot, so I keep coming back to my original version, forcing myself to make it work. I try to use the depth that is already established within the 3D horse's anatomy and just paint over it. However, I can't shake the feeling that the knight looks ridiculous on this horse's back. I struggle to find the right reference with the exact angle and focal length that I'm aiming for. Most images that I find are shot with a zoom lens, which flattens the curves in the gestures and a ton of, it makes it difficult to generate an image that pulls you into the scene. During this stage of creation, I ignored the lack of stability in my sketch and tried to save the image by rendering the realism into it. This will become a bad habit and pattern during this painting process of the image through the entire month. As I start to paint in the background, it comes to my attention that the pose that my horse is in is actually more fitting for the Knight of Wands tarot card. According to the original Raider Waite deck, which depicts the Knight of Wands on a rearing horse, the Knight of Swords, in contrast, is shown in a racing position, as it is the fastest of all knights. So at this point, I'm relieved and think that I will have an easier time replacing the sword with a wand because it is shorter and will be easier to fit into the frame. So I changed the background and landscape up again to make it suit the symbolism of the original card. One of my stream friends, Alex, suggests to add fire to the horse's mane and tail, an idea that I immediately like because the wand card's element happens to be fire. But I can't find contentment with the horse's anatomy and gesture, however, so I keep overpainting and trying to get some dynamic back into the image, as it feels super stiff and not at all engaging to me. Rendering a turd is what comes to my mind at this point. I keep trying to compensate for the lack of depth with magic and fire and a longer wand for readability. However, I soon come to understand that the fire flattens the image out because of its bright value even more. I tell myself that the only person I have to compete with is myself, so the goal is to upstage my last tarot card with each new painting. As I'm close to finishing this one, I simply have to admit to myself that it is nowhere near the last Three of Cups tarot card, so I will have to scrap it and start from scratch. So I found this epic knight image on Instagram that put my own image entirely to shame, so talking of not compete with other artists, right? So I considered to scrap the horse entirely and make something like that. However, I hate giving up because of my lack of skill, so I decided to simply get better at painting horses. Blaming my lack of knowledge in horse anatomy, I go on to paint horse gesture studies. I need to be able to paint a horse as lively as possible, and I want to intuitively get their spirited nature down on paper. I look up other artists' horse studies to get a feeling for their line work and way of simplifying their bodies. Then I limit myself to sketching and values so I can focus on my Achilles heel, which obviously is dynamic gesture, composition, and anatomy. I like the wand pointing above or below the camera. I also add salamanders onto the wand, as they are a symbol from the original deck standing for fire. It soon proves to be extremely difficult to paint at this angle with the limited reference that I had at hand. The more paint overs of the sketches I created, the stiffer they got. In order to save myself from the lack of solid line work, I decided to paint in the color palette immediately and see where my intuition would guide me. Apparently my anger and frustration leaked into the image as the knight and horse started to become extremely dark and evil looking. I enjoyed this idea a ton, but I still felt crippled from the lack of know-how I had when it comes to painting horses dynamically with a wide angle view looking from the ground up. Somebody suggested I'd go and make a 3D version of it, but I didn't want to fall back into that time-consuming rabbit hole, so I thought I could successfully resolve my issues if I only rendered this image long enough. The stuff looked odd in that perspective. I wasn't sure what the knight's legs were supposed to be doing and where the horse's legs were supposed to be pointing to, how big the muscles are supposed to be from this point of view with this angle, with this focal length, so it was a nightmare. I kept looking back at the last version, praying to the universe that at this point I was at least doing a better job than in the last image. Always aimed to be better than previously, I kept reminding myself. As time progressed, the image looked stiffer as it desperately tried to be dynamic and engaging, and I kept becoming increasingly embarrassed with myself as none of this looked anything like my photorealistic renders that I painted at the beginning of this project. Ignoring that the image isn't quite there yet, I started to add the colors and fire effects nonetheless. I needed progress, and Maybe the epiphany on how to make this look realistic would come along the way I hoped. I focused on getting some nice armor rendering and some nice engravings in as well. Get that fill and rim light into to make it pop, you know. The salamanders proved to be a little too dominant, confusing and distracting, so it was a matter of time till I would scrap them and rehome them to a different part of the image. I tried to make the wand more naturalistic looking with the wood growing around it, but the shape language being such a contrast to the stiff armor made it look like the knight had previously stolen the wand from a forest wizard, and I didn't like this idea. Then I thought of a lance and designed the straps around the crystal of the wand, but I've been met with feedback that the wand rather looked like candy. So I tried to lighten the mood as well by changing the color palette and values with it. I create more space around the wand by zooming out. The salamanders find their new home on the carpet blanket as embroidery, a little Easter egg I'm kind of proud of because I suck at being subtle. Things get extremely complicated when it comes to shiny metals and multiple different colored light sources. Giving in way too much candy stick feedbacks, I decide to give the wand another redesign while still keeping the shape language and materials of the knight's armor in mind. I needed something dangerous looking and cool. Unfortunately, the final result started looking a lot like a fancy club, and so I started sketching again, thinking I'll make something entirely of my own before I slap myself, reminding myself that I don't have the patience to start from scratch, so I get braver with my delivery of the knight. I decide to show his face to make the image look more inviting and relatable. I started off painting his face without reference, and since my face was the only thing that I painted, he starts to look a lot like a rather androgynous version of myself, so I resort to reference picking to find a face more suitable for this role. However, the knight's body language seems to be kinda slacking and lazy, and I want something fiery and energetic, so I find an image of a statue with an energetic depiction of a man on a horse with a flag raised high above his head, and I think, hey, why not? So I decide to focus on a spirited gesture and facial expression and give up on the extreme angle view that tortured me for 3 weeks into this project. This new composition gives me a hipster photography type of vibe, which I'm totally okay with. I tried to introduce some depth through the clouds in the background and nice pastel but also fiery colors to go along with the theme. Now, with the background being established, I need to reflect it in the armor as well, which proves to be extremely difficult as it takes pure brain power to calculate and render how the sky would show with metal bent a certain way. See, this is where doing studies previously becomes super useful, as you have some muscle memory embedded for this type of challenge. I introduce a cape, like in the last image, for some material contrast and render relief. I like to think of him wearing representative pretty clothes that don't get damaged or dirty, as he's a wizarding knight that doesn't end up in close combat situations. I also add swirly designs to the horse's helmet that remind me a bit of Chinese dragon paintings. Another tiny nod to the fire element, right? But I need to tone the detail down as it gets quite distracting at this point. I'm too scared to glance back at the 2 older iterations of this card. I don't want to get disappointed by my lack of skill growth and advancement, so I add a feathery and winged breastplate to the horse, as I like the phoenix idea that one of my viewers on my stream threw in. I wonder what type of magic the knight might be conjuring up, so I start designing levitating earth or glowy sprinkles around the wand, and 2 ideas that I quickly scrap. I keep rendering as if on autopilot in the hopes that this image will improve. I'm at the end with my wits, as I feel that the whole thing still feels stiff, but I'm too tired and lost to make sense of what I keep doing wrong. At this point, I simply focus on polishing this turd and maybe fixing some anatomy gesture aspects here and there. Someone mentions the image being monochromatic, to which I vehemently disagree, but at closer inspection I do find that the colors were very muted or even gray in the blue area. Most of it was in the realm of reds and pinks. I also tried to reintroduce the idea of flames back in again, not to only have the feathers on the knight's helmet be in flames, but also the horse's mane and tail. However, this very same viewer, Zeynep, thought it would be a good idea to have the fire come from below the horse's armor. I kept it despite its difficulty with readability and tried to work the lighting around the fire by adding more shadow to the horse's body and night. I also added more blue to the shadow parts and ended up with an overly colorful and saturated image which infantilized the whole scene more than the topic even suggested. I thought that hard sunset lighting on the bodies would make them pop more, so I worked in a strong rim or main light. I felt pretty forlorn without proper reference of armor in this type of lighting and environment, but I kept pushing through. Yet another detail that came to my attention was the garment or cape that the knight is wearing. It was missing something, so I decided to do my research on silks and satin and found an orange dress with the type of embroidery that I'd expect to find in this type of cape. It was perfect and helped settle the knight into the image more. Dominic pointed out that the knight's hip area looked weird, and after short deliberation I concluded that he was missing the hip bone entirely. I lassoed out his torso, moved it and the horse's head up a centimeter and got to a relieving result that felt less ridiculous. Checking the image in black and white also helps with value design. I wanted to see if I could push the shadows more. However, I refused to have black shadows, so I heightened the darks in the curve. I wanted some orb or lens flare action with the wand to get some extra attention, and I've been told that I've overdone my post-image processing and that everything started to look desaturated and muddy, so I aim to find a middle ground to somehow paint the old version back in. The placement of the Knight of Swords icon proved to be difficult and is subject to change in the future. At the time of the editing of this video, I go back to it with a fresh eye and do some contrast, black point adjusting and detail repainting. At some point, I simply have to give up for the time being and accept that this is the best I unfortunately can do. I have never tortured myself so much in my life and never scrapped this many paintings for a single project. My goal was to include every symbol of the original Raider Waite Tarot card in my painting. However, I believe that this art direction ended up being more of a restriction, which resulted in an undeniably rigid piece. I will make sure that the next Knight card is more engaging, dynamic, original, and overall better done than the last. If you feel the same way during your own painting process, now you know that you're not the only angry artist torturing yourself for lack of skill and craftsmanship. If you found my content to be useful, consider to let me know in the comments or leave a thumbs up. You can also subscribe to my YouTube channel to be notified when the next video comes up.